Welcome to Scribbled, a podcast with reviews and conversations about some of the most important topics in economics and in global affairs. My name is Krzysztof Mroczkowski. In this episode, I am very happy to welcome back to the program Dr. Andrea Lorenzo Capussela. Hi, Andrea.
Hello. Hello.
Andrea is a visiting fellow at the LSE, and we previously talked about his book, The Political Economy of Italy's Decline. We want to follow up on that discussion and go further to discuss the difficulties that liberalism has in regulating capitalism. I hope we will also get to talk a little bit about the present and future of the European Union. So, Andrea, let's begin. To sum up where we left our previous discussion, Italy, and let me add a number of other countries, struggles with social order, where powerful established interests create an environment in which the faulty implementation of the law in effect punishes efforts for positive change by individuals, by firms, by organizations. This is a collective action problem, where behavior of a large chunk of social actors, agents, would have to change simultaneously to change the system. An enormous change is called for, and you argue it has to come from a realm of ideas. Now, we can imagine such sweeping change happening through a revolution or a coup, but how can it happen in parliamentary liberal democracies with entrenched powerful private interests?
Yes. Well, I don't really have a revolution in mind. And I think that although the change that will be needed is sweeping, what is crucial is to begin to change expectations. You can picture the problem as one of a spiral, which can rotate in two directions. It can either be a vicious circle or a virtuous circle. If you begin to change expectations, the rotation of the spiral will change. And once that begins, improvement will be incremental, but can be self-sustaining. So the trick, if you like, is to change expectations. That is why I think, that is the conclusion of my assessment, that the problem largely is a collective action problem, as you said. To put it in two words, the causal chain I see is slowing growth, caused by slowing productivity, caused by weak rule of law, which is in the context of an advanced economy is a serious constraint on growth because it depresses competition and creative destruction and therefore also innovation. And the link with politics is really the political accountability. As the rule of law, to quote a paper by Joe Stiglitz and Carla Hoff, the rule of law is what stops the few from stealing from the many. So you can't expect the rule of law to remain weak for long unless there is a problem in the political system. And the main problem, I think, is weak political accountability. Weak rule of law and weak political accountability tend to go together. Certainly, you cannot have permanently weak rule of law if you have strong political accountability, because the general interest will impose itself. Now, the weakness of political accountability can be explained in many ways, but at bottom, I think it is a collective action problem, which takes a double form, if you like. The diffusion and prevalence of special interests, organized minorities on one hand, and the weakness of what the theorists of collective action described as the latent majorities, like the general public or the taxpayer, or and the interest of these majorities can only be properly advanced by broad and pluralist organizations such as political parties. Another example is large trade unions, but mainly political parties. The link with Italy's history is clear here, because since there was a big rupture in Italy's history in the early 90s, 92, 94, great, colossal, in fact, corruption investigations, which brought down the whole political elite. After that, things didn't really improve for reasons that we can discuss. But one effect was also to further weaken political parties. Political parties now, as in much of the West, are very personalized, fairly thin, lacking ideas, not very different from each other, permeable, vulnerable to special interests. In Italy, all these phenomena take a very acute dimension. And this explains why the interests of the majority have trouble in defending themselves from organized minorities. To explain better this idea of the vicious circles and of the collective action problem, we made another example the other day concerning the accounts of companies and their capitalization. Now we can make an example concerning, for instance, tax evasion, which in Italy is between 2 and 3 times higher than in Germany, France, or Great Britain, relative to the taxes actually collected. Now, citizens pay taxes and expect public services of equivalent value. Every ordinary citizen, I think, prefers to have good public services to being able to evade taxes here and there. Nobody becomes rich by evading taxes. I mean, ordinary citizens. And I think they're all aware that they would live better in a country where taxes are paid, political accountability is higher, and for both reasons, public services are better. If they find themselves in a country where tax evasion is high, however, which erodes the value of the public services that everyone receives, they will have a strong individual interest, short-term individual interest, in trying to evade a bit of taxes themselves too, in order to compensate, if you like, the missing segment, the missing bit in the value of public services they receive. This is what, if you like, the actual behavior of society suggests. There is tax evasion, it remains high, and it's fairly diffused in the country and across the population. But this is, if you like, the revealed preferences of Italians. I think their latent preferences would be, in the majority, in the wide majority, to live in a country that stands on a different equilibrium, on a low tax evasion, high public services equilibrium. How can they move from one to the other? What can persuade people to abandon the seemingly rational choice of evading taxes a little bit, as much as they can, to compensate that effect, and begin a movement towards the better equilibrium? One important thing is their expectations. If they expect that many others will behave in the same way, then the prospect of a change in equilibrium becomes credible, and it becomes in everyone's interest to participate in it. If you like, there is a clash here between the collective interest and individual rationality. Collective interest would be to live in a well-governed society where tax evasion is an exception and public services are good. Individual rationality tends to keep you in the bad equilibrium if you are there already. The way to bridge this gap is to present to the population a credible prospect of a switch to the higher equilibrium. If this prospect is credible, expectations will begin to change, behaviors will begin to change, and that will have a snowball effect, which is very similar to the opposite snowball effect that you have when you see governance declining. So this, if you like, is a partial answer to one part of your question, mainly to the question whether we need a revolution or not. Not necessarily. It's really all a matter of expectations, if the problem is, as I think, a collective action problem.
Mm-hmm. So while you were talking, actually, I didn't think about this question before, but it came to my mind. I reminded myself of a lecture by John Nye, an institutional economist from George Mason University, who recounted how he visited Manila World Bank office, and he reviewed the papers and policies and recommendations, and they really delved deep into why it doesn't work. And essentially, what they came up with is a problem of the social order, of the political power, of the power in society, powerful people. And he basically came up with the idea, look, we can create a power coalition that can push some things through that would be progressive enough to push this new equilibrium. However, we would have to have this selected group of powerful real estate moguls to also benefit. So we basically corrupt them with policy. That's what he, in this developing economy context, argued. Now we are here in the context of a developed economy, and you say it should come from the realm of ideas and expectations, but there should be some sort of political coalition or power coalition behind it. You talked in our previous interview about the elites, that you have some portion of the elites that are progressive, that want some more innovation and more competition in the system, but they are dominated by the bigger elites. How could they play a role? And what do you see? You talk about the movement, the political parties. How would you see this could bear out in reality in Italy?
Yes, let's talk about elites first, and then maybe political coalitions. Italy hosts many excellent companies that manage to beat foreign competitors despite the systemic problems that Italy has. Among Italy's economic elites, there are also firms and people that would greatly benefit from a system that is more open to creative destruction and to innovation. If you are an innovative firm, you don't fear creative destruction. You actually want it because it will give you greater space. It will allow greater resources to come into your company to develop it. So within the elites, there is a segment that would greatly benefit from improving the system, and those elites don't have to be bribed. Maybe the difference with a developing country is this: they're not engaged in predation; they're simply obstructing and delaying a process which is necessarily a conflictual process, as the name creative destruction already suggests. And the question is, if you like, what proportion of economic elites fear it, and what proportion would be willing to take a step to make it easier, to assist it. Among elites as well, there is a difference between so-called revealed preferences and latent preferences. The fact that their behavior doesn't suggest that they are willing to confront the system and change it does not imply that they would not benefit from it. So there are latent resources also among economic elites that could assist this process. And one could imagine an alliance among sections of the economic elites, sections of the political elites, and whatever organization manages to represent in a pluralist way, the general interest in improving these things we talked about. That would be the basis for possible political coalitions to first of all, well, let's maybe talk about what, before we talk about how these political coalitions could be built, let's talk about what would be needed to change expectations. I talk about, and I write in the book about the question of interest and ideas, because what is leading many parts of society, among elites, but also among ordinary citizens and ordinary firms, if you like, what is leading them not to press for change is that each draws some benefits from the status quo, larger or smaller ones. So it is a question of their interests are stopping them from pressing for change. But one might ask, what is an interest? It is not something which is given in nature. An interest, a very good paper by Danny Roderick explains, an interest is always the product of ideas. It is a product of the way in which each understands their own identity, their own position in society, in which the way in which each understands the constraints that society, that reality presents for realizing their aims, and the ways in which the aims can be realized. So if it is interest, if you like, are a combination of ideas on what one's aims are and what the ways of realizing them are. These are ideas, and they can change through reflection and through observation and through analysis of reality. So public debate about what is desirable, what is possible, what the problems are, has at least the potential of changing ideas and therefore also changing interests. And this is very interesting to me because this work of discussing ideas and interests can help unearth the latent preferences from below the revealed preferences. It can help, for instance, people who are perhaps not aware of this, can help people to realize that, yes, they would live better in a society where everyone pays their taxes and everyone is quite careful about what political elites do, because from that, the quality of public services depends. So, and that they would all live better in such a society than in one where the solution is really trying to avoid paying taxes. That can be achieved, at least in part, through public debate. So that would be, if you like, a prerequisite for an attempt to present a credible perspective of shifting to a higher equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Let me maybe interject with some example for our viewers. I remember in Poland, I think it was late 90s or early 40s. I think it was 90s. It used to be the case 30 years ago that the traffic police used to be corrupt, and they could, you could easily skip a ticket by, just giving some pocket change money to the policeman. That was the rule, not the aberration in the reality. 30 years on, 20 years later, actually, it was completely eviscerated. Of course, it's a combination of different aspects. The country is richer, the policemen have better salaries, but part of it was also public information campaigns that I don't give, I don't take. I'm not a fish to take. You had loads of bumper stickers on the cars that inform that this is a car whose owner is not giving bribes. So it's also some sort of public commitment, but it was all accompanied by this sort of social public information campaign. Is this some part of the sort of debate, the preconditions that you have in mind?
Well, this is an excellent example of what I mean. Um, Italy's problem is broader. It is, in a way, one should not exaggerate, but it is the whole social order that is relatively inefficient and unequal. Therefore, if you like, the similar initiatives would have to be applied to the whole social order or to the various bits. Uh, Tax evasion would be an example, but you know there are several other instances in which you see the same kind of vicious circles and the same kind of tension between collective interests and individual rationality. Illegal construction is widespread, for instance. And it is widespread also because various governments across the previous decades have granted amnesties for illegal construction. And often when there are earthquakes, to which Italy is prone, you hear that illegally constructed houses crumble and many people die. You see, it is clearly a vicious circle, and clearly the revealed preference, build an illegal house because it costs less, takes less time, and anyway you will have an amnesty a few years down the line. Clearly that interest is in a medium to long term entirely irrational, even though it seems rational immediately. So conversations of this kind could help. But then you certainly need, I mean, if it is a collective action problem, it therefore is a coordination problem, and it is on the scale of a nation. You cannot imagine to tackle such a problem without not just ideas, but also organization. In the past, the organizations doing this kind of work used to be political parties, the traditional political parties born in the 19th century and dominant in the 20th century. As I said, in Italy, parties have changed a lot, have become very weak and very thin organizations, no longer capable really of collecting the demands and the ideals of society and offering, coordinating them and offering to society one vision of the common good. I don't think the parties of the past century could be recreated because society is different, but certainly we would need organizations that are equally capable of doing that job, of coordinating demands and shaping expectations. What makes me relatively optimistic in perhaps not in the short term, but in the medium term, is that the space for political action, the space for new political ideas and even actors is very wide in Italy. In the past two elections, we had very high electoral volatility. Many people change their electoral preferences between one election and the other. In 2013, it went close to 40%, which has almost no precedent in established democracies. 2 years ago, it was a bit less, but still very high. And new parties come and go. They rise up and down in public support very much. The League, for example, was at 4% in 2013. It grew up to even close to 40% in the summer of last year, and now it's less. And in such a fluid environment, any convincing idea would have a lot of space to impose itself. And if a convincing idea enters the field, other political parties will have an interest in replicating it. We were talking before about whether also elites can have an interest in improving things, and certainly they do. Segments. There are segments in every society, in every section of society. If one can imagine a sort of minimum common program of, if you like, rebuilding or actually strengthening the basis of a republican polity, strengthening the rule of law, strengthening political accountability. These two pillars could be the basis for a minimum common political program that could become the patrimony of many political parties. Left and right, maybe excluding the extremes, but left and right could join in supporting such a platform. So if someone manages to credibly propose it and bring it into the public sphere, then I think that other parties will have an interest in sharing it, because without sharing it, they would risk losing votes. That could create enough consensus and for starting to build on it, and would make the platform also credible and therefore capable of changing expectations.
I was also thinking, because don't give, don't take bribes, pay your taxes, be a good citizen. It's also it's about incentives. It's about a new equilibrium, but it's also a bit of an ethical message, right? I was thinking about the role of spiritual leaders, of course, the role of the Catholic Church in Italy, perhaps, or maybe some local civil society. Do you see maybe after, for example, the collapse of the bridge, or rather disasters, do you see some sort of grassroots civil society movement towards some better standards, and the push for the politicians to take care of it and change it?
Yes, yes. Especially not just me, but many people say that this pandemic has stimulated a lot of solidarity and civic engagement among the population. Maybe this tension will decline now that the pandemic, in a way, is slowing down and life returns to a normal of semblance of normalcy. But that is certainly true. On the other hand, active citizenship is not extremely widespread in Italy. The data the data suggests that the percentage of the population that is engaged is less than the average in the Union. Also, those politically active are fairly few. But that is not really decisive. I don't draw from that an indication that Italians are, if you like, resigned or quietists. All it, as the problems are now really biting into the flesh of society, the emergence of some credible ideas, credible proposals, could stimulate a wide reaction among the population, participation as well. Conversely, I don't expect too much from the church. Not really, because in the past the church didn't always play a very useful role, to put it this way. For about half a century, they supported the rule of the governing parties led by the Christian Democrats, which didn't help. In the past, they supported the position of the church was mainly to provide political support, sometimes openly, even recently, and to make it dependent on the main choices that the church cares about, such as abortion or marriage and such things. So it is not obvious that the church will always play a useful role. It is true that recently, especially in Italy, the church, through the Pope chiefly, has spoken very harshly about corruption and about, I think Pope Francis even said that corruption is the one crime that cannot really be redeemed and cannot be really be, because there is hardly any genuine repentance in corruption. You can kill and repent, but if you take money, you do it because that's your plan. You will always take money in procurement, and it makes sense, and it's useful that he said that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from this discussion on active citizenry and political coalitions, I think that would be a good segue into our discussion on republicanism and liberalism. You wrote an article called "The Liberal Conception of Freedom is Incapable of Addressing the Problems of Contemporary Capitalism." You start with referencing Branko Milanovic's book, and I quote, "Branko Milanovic identifies four troublesome features in meritocratic liberal capitalism. These are the rising share of capital income in total income, which undermines meritocracy, the very high concentration of capital income, which runs counter to the objective of a property-owning democracy, the rising association of high capital and labor incomes in the same people or families, which exacerbates inequality and hinders attempts to curb it, and the polarization of society, shown by the declining share and purchasing power of the middle classes, which destabilizes democracy and threatens to turn it into a plutocracy or a populist regime." So, given that, what is the liberal answer to those problems?
Well, the liberal answer is what we've seen so far. In the years prior to 2008, which was not very much, and in the years subsequent, which was also not very much. I mean, much more was done, but we cannot really say that Western societies have changed very much in their structure since the global financial crisis. Maybe the pandemic will accelerate the movement towards change, but the main, well, I have to say, by the way, that when we talk of Italy, I mean, I can speak with some confidence because I've been studying it quite a lot. Now we move on to a field that is very delicate for me, which is political theory or political philosophy, and I cannot really say much more than what I wrote in that article. But I'm fairly convinced of what I wrote there, and the essence of my observation about liberalism is more or less this. I was indeed starting from those features of contemporary capitalism that Branko Milanovic's book underlines. And I was suggesting that often the reverse of inequalities is often some form of private domination, an unequal relationship between different individuals, which is arguably as much a source of discontent as inequality itself. Those features that Milanovic mentions are all contributors to the rise of inequalities. They're probably also contributors to the rise of these relationships of domination among individuals. And my observation was that liberal theory cannot really say that those features and those inequalities are a fundamental challenge to their idea of the good society. Because if you like, domination and inequality can be features of those societies. And if you go back to the origin of the liberal theory, the liberal notion of freedom, which is defined as absence of interference in one's choices, you will also see why moving from liberal theory or within a liberal framework, it is also more difficult to tackle those problems, because that notion of freedom, namely that freedom is absence of interference in one's choices, implies that virtually any public action, any law, for example, is an interference in public choices. The speed limits are, for example. Of course, they are justified, but the discussion in a liberal framework is whether the law, the speed limit, for example, is a justified interference in people's choices. As equality is a controversial value, not everyone shares it, not everyone agrees with others that the desired level of equality is such. There is debate about the relationship between equality and growth, between equality and even innovation. Now we are beginning to rediscuss it, because if you like, until 15 or 20 years ago, it was hardly discussed. Milanovic keeps saying that until recently, people were wondering why he was dealing with inequality. Now we are discussing it, but the perspective from which, in most of our societies, we are discussing it is exactly that. To what extent can we limit freedom in order to protect inequality, in order to protect equality? I don't want to claim that there is no tension between these two values, but I want to claim that the kind of tension you have depends entirely or largely on the notion of freedom that you take. The liberal notion of freedom is now hegemonic, is dominant. It is the notion that comes spontaneously to everyone, even without being aware of it, but that it is not the only one. And I try to describe the possible merits of another notion of freedom, which is much older, which is a Republican notion of freedom, which we inherit from the writings of Roman scholars. In fact, it comes from Roman law, which divided between free men and women, and slaves. It is well described you find it in Cicero, you find it later in Machiavelli, you find it later in Republican thinkers in England, in the US, elsewhere. And it has had a revival lately with Quentin Skinner in the UK, Philip Pettit in the US, and other writers. And this idea is precisely based on the distinction between liber homo, the free man and women, and slaves. Freedom means absence of domination, not being a slave of someone else, not being dominated.
Mm-hmm. So to recap, what you say is the liberal definition of freedom is non-interference, but it also means non-interference in, for example, relationship between me being crushed by some great corporation, right? If they can get away with it, the state interferes as little as possible in the markets, in the employment conditions, and the liberal freedom is quite okay with inequality, can be quite okay with private domination. It reminds me a little bit of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his speeches against the corporate giants of his day, the monopolies, that the issue is private despotism, private tyrannies, without which you cannot have personal liberties, you cannot enjoy it, you cannot be fully citizens in charge of the republic. So against this liberal non-interference, you have this issue of non-domination, and that perhaps much better captures what people are frustrated with and what they are struggling with. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about, how can we tell if we live in a Republican reality? Can you speak to the so-called eyeball test that you wrote about? How can we know, okay, this is what our constitution meant for us, the democracy, the laws enshrined, we will not be dominated. What do they really mean? How can we pass the eyeball test?
Yes, Your quote of is exactly right, and it is exactly what I meant. From a liberal standpoint, you tackle problems such as child labor um, conceptually in this way. We have freedom of contract. We have two people freely contracting employment, but we decided at some stage that child labor was unacceptable for other reasons, and we decided that that was not to be allowed. We might now be having a similar discussion in Italy, for instance, about the most obvious forms of precarious employment, which are, on one hand, we start discussing about whether they are efficient or not, whether they maybe depress productivity, and whether also they are fair. But from a Republican standpoint, you would be discussing about the freedom of the person who is in precarious employment. Because if my income depends on the arbitrary choices of the person who gives me temporary employment, then I'm not really free, Republicans say, because I depend on the arbitrary choices of someone else. Therefore, it is a question of freedom, even before it is a question of social justice or fairness or whatever. And turning these problems into questions of freedom makes them, if you like, more acute, more salient, because to my mind, there is no higher value in the political sphere than freedom. So that is what, if you like, that is the benefit, even the practical benefit of taking the Republican approach into mind in discussing these issues. And there are, maybe if we have a little more time, maybe the easiest way to clarify the distinction is with a paradox which is very frequent in Republican literature. It is the paradox of the free slave. Liberals would have to accept that a slave whose master is extremely benevolent is a free person, because the master is so benevolent that the slave can do whatever she wants. Republicans say not so, because domination remains. The happiness of the slave depends entirely on the benevolence of the master, and the benevolence might be withdrawn and therefore might have to be cultivated. So the slave will naturally have a tendency to self-censor and to be kind to the master. That is typical of the relationship of domination, which creates a servile attitude. If you apply this example to, yes, contemporary, very precarious forms of employment in the gig economy, for example, well, you see the difference between approaching it from a liberal standpoint and from a Republican standpoint, which really tells you that we are talking about the freedom of those people who are in gig jobs. The eyeball test is a system devised by one of these thinkers to try to understand whether whether in one society or one person enjoys Republican freedom or not. The eyeball test is this: you are free if you can look others in the eye without fear or deference. If you can look your employer in the eye without fear or deference, if you can look your spouse in the eye without fear or deference, and so on. If you can, you are a free man in a republic, free homo, man or woman in a Republican sense. If not, you are not free. At least in that sphere of your life, you are not free. So the person in precarious employment is probably not free in that sphere of his or her life, which is an important one. And once we adopt this approach, we can then discuss how wide we want this sphere into which everyone is their own master and they can look anyone else in the eye without fear or deference. We can decide how wide it has to be. We can, for instance, if we were to give to everyone a minimum salary equal to the median salary, to the mean salary, well, I think most people in most spheres of their life would be fully free in a Republican sense. Maybe we can't afford that. Or maybe we think that that would weaken incentives in such a way that we would impoverish, and that would not work. So the discussion here becomes much more complicated when we discuss how wide we want this sphere of freedom to be. But looking at this problem from the perspective of republicanism, namely caring about domination and its consequences, I think clarifies the issues and is also an easier approach to the problems of contemporary capitalism, which creates large imbalances of power. Republican freedom really is about power. It's a question of power. If you distribute power, make it more contestable, you increase freedom, not just other things.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. There's one bit in your article where you deal with how in liberalism you have pluralism and you have checks and balances. So, if we have many political parties and we have independent judiciary, separation of powers, one would think that would already give us the desired reality. But actually, in a Republican sort of way of thinking, it doesn't necessarily, because it doesn't necessarily preserve you from the dominance. And I'm thinking about how in Poland we have this attack on judiciary by the right-wing conservative party, but which is also distributionist. And many people who are not middle class, who are working class, they think, well, it's maybe bad, they shouldn't be so greedy and have all the political power and judiciary power. But actually, I'm less dominated economically now because of the redistribution programs. And, it really speaks to this other aspect of freedom that just liberalism completely ignores or maybe is unaware of it. What do you think? What's the root cause? Why are liberals simply not seeing this domination, private domination part of the equation?
My observation here is that I think it is more difficult to defend checks and balances, and also checks and balances chiefly, but I don't want to say also the pluralism of society, which is a fact. But it is more difficult to defend checks and balances from a liberal standpoint, because another implication of the liberal approach is that freedom and democracies are two separate values, both desirable, both valuable, but they're separate. One doesn't flow from the other. Famously, for example, Hobbes said that the citizens of Lucca, one of the remaining Italian republics that had written liberty on its gates, those citizens were not more free than the subjects of the Ottoman Sultan, which, as a matter of fact, was perhaps true in the sense of what they could actually do without interference. If you move from a Republican standpoint, democracy and freedom join together, because we talked about until now about private domination, but of course you have to defend one also from public domination. Laws and the state and public action can create this sphere of freedom for every citizen, but the state shouldn't be a dominating one. In order for the state and laws not to be dominating ones, citizens will have to have control over the kind of laws that are made. That requires democracy, and that has fairly demanding implications for the model of democracy you have, because you would want certainly checks and balances. Philip Pettit also talks about a contestatory citizenry that is able and willing to take action, to organize in order to make pressure on the political system, on the public authorities, including on the checks and balances system, for it to function more effectively. So a Republican, in purely theoretical terms, a Republican would find it easier to address or to respond to challenges such as those you have in Poland, because one could say, well, be careful, citizens, because if we allow the checks and balances system to be degraded, we are degrading our democracy and therefore also our freedom. We maybe today or tomorrow and the next day we are getting a bit more in redistribution, but we are giving away not just our democracy, also our freedom, which is something that liberals cannot say. They can only say we are giving away our democracy. They cannot say we are also giving away our freedom, because, and here the structure of the notion of freedom is really remains the same as Hobbes. It is true that if what matters is the amount of interference in one's choices, you can imagine a liberal dictatorship, so to speak, to coin a paradox, a dictatorship that doesn't interfere too much in people's life. For example, forgive me?
Singapore would be an example of such.
Yes, perhaps. But let's make an imaginary example, a dictatorship that doesn't want speed limits in streets. You don't have any, that interference you don't have. Of course, more people die because of accidents, but that's another matter. You are more free and it's a more dangerous world. A Republican says, no, as you have a dictatorship, you are unfree, no matter how fast you can go on the streets. Whether the government interferes with your choices or not is, if you like, secondary to the power relations that you have with the government.
Great. I think this is great, and we totally agree about those power relations. I wanted to now switch gears a little bit and get a little bit more into uncharted territory, because I want to talk about the European Union, and nobody knows what's the future of it. Coordinating 27 states is a nightmare. They all have internal politics, and we have some dreaming European enthusiasts who argue that this is the future. We need to be strong together in the 21st century against China, against India, against the rising geopolitical world. On the other hand, you cannot ignore the realities that internal politics of every single one country can be a block on the process altogether, and it may prove hardly viable. And now we have this effort by France and Germany to start a little bit of a common budget, the debt neutralization, the so-called Hamiltonian or state building or closer federation building moment that's described as a brave step, but is it really? I wanted to ask you a little bit how you think about the European Union. How far can we go? How fast should we? What are the limits of integration? The floor is yours.
Thank you. I am very encouraged by that Franco-German plan, which is now a plan of the Commission, chiefly because of the comparison with the response to the 2008 crisis and to the sovereign debt crisis, which were timid, often late, partial, episodic responses. This seems something of an altogether different kind. One might argue that it was belated as well. But what really matters is the size, which is unprecedented, and especially the what you say, the fact that it will be based on common debt de facto and common resources. We don't yet know how it will, whether and in what shape it will be approved. But as I hope that European political and economic integration will progress, I think this is a very important step in that direction. Not because it will create a fiscal union. Maybe talking of a Hamiltonian moment is misplaced, or at the very least premature. And I don't think there will be, Europe will replicate exactly those choices. But certainly beginning to build a common resources for such an intervention will also have a demonstration effect. We will see how it works, and on that we will hopefully build on. What is crucial, I think, is the direction of progress that this plan can establish, can give to the Union, and this, I think, is a qualitative difference with the responses to the previous crisis in the past decade.
Would you say a fiscal union, a push towards, a more closer fiscal, perhaps even tax alignment between the countries, is something that the member states should pursue, or is it too early, or is it a misplaced demand given structural differences between countries?
Well, I see a growing consensus on some greater alignment in tax policies to reduce tax competition, to solidify mainly the tax base in the taxation of corporations and such things. When we talk about a fiscal union, I think many people see the sense in it and the fact that something of that sort would be needed to rebalance the architecture of the monetary union, which lacks that support. On the other hand, especially talking from Italy, we cannot forget the legacy problem. There are countries, Italy among them, with huge debt. This debt will grow now, others too. This legacy problem is close to being intractable, and this is the main reason why we had such weak and partly ineffective responses to the crisis of the previous decade. Now there is a greater scope for addressing it, but certainly the legacy problem remains. I do think that over time it will be possible to solve it, but fixing oneself on the purpose of fiscal union tomorrow and debt mutualization tomorrow could be counterproductive and is not necessarily the best way to proceed. The purpose really should not be solving the debt problem, which is a problem of today or in the next 20 years. The question is looking at the next 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. That is the direction in which I would set the progression of political and economic integration. The question of the debt, as long as other crises such as the sovereign debt crisis, as long as such disturbances can be avoided, and whatever can avoid them will be welcome, as long as they can be avoided, I think we need to allow maybe more time for, there is this big discussion about, especially among federalists and the opponents of federalists, the question of whether we already have a European demos or not, and whether greater integration requires a demos before, or will be able to build it, which is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but certainly we don't yet have a European demos in the same sense that we have an Italian one or a Belgian one even. So that will require some time to progress. Also, in order to avoid the danger of the past decades, which we see very clearly here in Italy, that the European project, which is, I think, crucial for the lives of every one of us, be seen by too many, perhaps mistakenly, but be seen as an elite project. That is a risk that we cannot run. We, talking, this we includes everyone who hopes in Europe and, if you like, whose hopes in the future are dependent on European integration. We cannot allow this to remain. We cannot allow Europe to be criticized credibly as an elite project. I don't want to say whether it's true or not, but many people say it and many are believed. Now, taking this crisis as an occasion for greater pushes in the direction of a fiscal union in such a way that some people don't fully understand what is happening would not be wise, I think. If we can defend Europe and the Italian public debt, which is, if you like, a ticking bomb planted at the foundations of the union, if we can save those from turbulences such as the sovereign debt crisis, I think it would be preferable to move in a more open and transparent way, tackling openly the problems that remain. I mean, those who say we cannot have a fiscal union because we have a moral hazard problem, because we have a big legacy problem that we're not willing to solve in the way that in the South many hope, I think they have a point. I don't think they are entirely right, but they have a point, and that those points have to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. On the other hand, Germans also have been free riding on the other side, on the structural.
But that is part of the discussion. I mean, the macroeconomic imbalances come in many forms. There are also very large current account surpluses next to the deficit. So that would be the discussion.
So maybe my last question, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about this longer term horizon of the EU. What should be our competitive model economically, but also maybe socially? We see a little bit of a divergence from the US and Chinese models on the GDPR, on the data. We seem to be a little, less head-on into, the future for whatever cost. We are a little more cautious. We're a little more consumer and citizen friendly. But questions remain whether this is competitively sustainable in the long term. What do you think? What should be the values and the economic power of the European Union in the future?
I find it hard to answer this question. My instinctive response would be that even if it comes at a cost, at an acceptable cost in economic efficiency, I would prefer this kind of stance that is more careful about the interests of consumers and the interests of citizens than elsewhere. Of course, it all depends on the notion of acceptability. I would stop here, but I would also like to add that if we go back to the theory of growth we read, for example, in Schumpeter, why would paying greater attention to the interests of consumers and of citizens and of civil society, why would it entail lesser economic efficiency. Protecting, if the question is whether or not to protect them from large corporations or big data, it doesn't necessarily follow that that in the long term entails less efficiency, because you might instead obtain a system where economic power is more contestable, where large firms are subject to more intense competition pressures. Now, the relationship between competition and innovation is a fraught one, but it doesn't go without saying that the so-called European model would be less efficient than those. Maybe what we are seeing is also the effect of lesser coordination among European nations than you see in China, which is highly politically centralized, or even in the US, where the federal government nonetheless plays an important coordination role in these sectors at the high end of technology. In Europe, this is much less. So maybe that is a bigger problem than the kind of approach, if you like, the European way of dealing with these things. Maybe the problem is lesser coordination, which hopefully will be one reason why we all decide to press for greater political and economic integration.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time, and this second interview, it was also a great pleasure. All the topics we covered, I'm sure all the viewers will really enjoy listening to, and thanks a lot once again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
So also thank you to all of our viewers. Please make sure to like and subscribe this video, share it with all your friends and any interested citizens you know, and see you next time in the next episode. Bye-bye.